All right, now we're getting into one of the heaviest sections of the course because it applies to both of the major speeches. In the informative speeches, data or research or any evidence that you bring in is going to be the key element that you're trying to get across to the audience. It's the stuff you're trying to get to stick into their head. In the persuasive speech, the data will often be the part that is going to do all of the work for you and basically prove to the audience A, that you've done your homework, and B, that you're right about some of the ideas that they might have conflicts with. So either way, buckle up because this is a fairly long series of pieces of information, but it's also one of the most productive. It's something that goes well beyond our class and basically gets to the heart of what it means to be a good critical thinker, somebody who knows how to find good information and also how to evaluate information that's presented to you. So when we support a speech, basically what I'm going to do is give you one of the oldest definitions of data, and that is a definition that comes from the actual argumentation theorist Stephen Toulmin. Basically, he considers data to be one of three things. One, objectively observable conditions, meaning stuff that you and I can point to, we can go do research on, we can agree upon it, either because it exists out in the physical world or because it was recorded and that record was reliable in its process. So that's going to be most of what we focus on because it's the part that it's easiest to teach and it's the easiest to also get wrong if it's not done well. Some examples of this would be things like statistics. We could also include things like physical proof, physical evidence, or scientific reasoning, as well as eyewitnesses and experts testifying about issues like Micro here with dirty jobs, somebody who does a great job at analyzing a lot of labor-based issues. And the weirdest example of this is one we've already mentioned before, which are narratives. Because even though the story of the talking scorpion and the talking frog never happened, the idea behind it is something that's shared in the public consciousness. Meaning that if all of us know that the story exists, that story becomes a useful thing. It becomes something that we can use in speeches as a kind of shorthand for other people to understand. So these are the kinds of evidence we're going to talk about in this process. But there are two others that are worth mentioning. The second kind is called beliefs or premises generally accepted by the audience. Now, the reason this is different than objectively observable conditions is that these are often all in our heads. For example, it's not uncommon for people to have the wrong belief, but if everybody agrees on that belief, it counts as evidence. A good example of this is a really common misconception that a lot of students have in America that Christopher Columbus had trouble trying to get funding for his trip because people didn't think that the Earth was round. That's actually wrong. People knew that the Earth was round. In fact, it had been proven about 2,000 years before that. But what was wrong was that they believed that the Earth was bigger than Columbus was allowing for, so the trip would have been bigger than any trip ever undertaken by an ocean voyage before. And that's actually true. So notice how that belief that Columbus had trouble getting money because people didn't think the world was round is shared by a lot of people and could therefore be used as evidence, even if it's incorrect. Now, getting away from things that are incorrect, we could also talk about premises that are actually somewhat stable, even though they might not be proven. For example, at any commencement address, you'll often hear somebody make a comment about how the children are the future. Well, okay, yeah, that's fair. But the children are also the future thieves and embezzlers and murderers, right? Every terrible person was at one point a child, so you can't guarantee that all children are going to become all good people. So it's something that we kind of agree upon, but it's a lot more fuzzy and a lot more ephemeral and hard to lock down. By definition, these are really hard to research, and they don't respond well to the kinds of tests of evidence that we're going to be using. The one exception here is that you can do audience analysis, meaning that you could actually figure out what kinds of beliefs the audience shares and then use those beliefs as an element in your speech. For example, if you believe that the audience all shares the love of a particular sports team, then you could reference that sports team in your speech and feel as though they would be favorable toward you. The final kind of evidence is all about logic, and that is the evidence that comes from having already proven something else to you. If I already proved an issue to you before, even if it's something you didn't agree with before I started speaking, once I convince you of it, I can now rely on it as evidence for later arguments. So that's going to be a lot more something we'll deal with in a course like argumentation, not so much in public speaking. There simply isn't time for it. The one exception is that your informative speeches can rely on the previous speech to affect the persuasive speech. So anything you lay out in the in-form, I will include in my analysis of your persuasive speech. So if you give me good background data in the in-form, that counts as evidence for your persuade. Now let's go after that first definition, the objectively observable conditions. What does it mean for something to be objective? Data in and of itself is usually objective in that it either exists or it does not. That's what objective means. For example, if I were to tell you that I'm tall, that's subjective. Some of you might come from families that have lots and lots of tall people in them. I'm about 6 foot tall. So for many of you, that's pretty normal sized. It's not necessarily gigantic. But if I were coaching Little League, suddenly I'm gigantic compared to those kids. So that standard changes based on who's talking. But the standard of what it means to be 6 feet tall doesn't change. Everybody who gets a tape measure can come up to me and find out that I am indeed about 6 feet tall. That's objective. Can two people use the same measurement to come to the same conclusion? So data is usually objective in that it exists or it doesn't exist. But we can still contest it even if the data is sitting there looking at us. For example, what kinds of data we choose to present is a subjective decision. A good example of this is a common phrase that's used in news broadcasting: if it bleeds, it leads. And what that means is that the first story on most evening news broadcasts will be about anything crime related, especially if fatalities or horrific events have occurred. So car chases, gunfights, those will almost always be your first story. Now, that happened, so it's true, it's objectively true that a gunfight happened, but the idea that it's always presented first gives it a special meaning, and that meaning's subjective. So I can choose to tell you some things and not tell you others. So for example, I could tell you about some corporation that did something really evil, but at the same time choose not to cover that same corporation giving a scholarship to a kid. The result would be you'd think that the corporation is totally evil and has no good in it at all. That's a non-objective approach. So in this very old reference to this, if you look in the background, you see that the guy on the left is being attacked by the guy on the right. But because of how it's framed in the camera, if you look on the little monitor, you'll see it looks exactly the opposite, as if the guy on the left is attacking the guy on the right. Perspective matters. Some quick examples that I threw in here are links to videos in which the person's point of view is actually the key issue, and feel free to pursue those and see exactly what I'm talking about. Another problem is that even if you were a good scientist, it's possible that the method you use to recover your data could actually skew the results. So the method of calling people, for example, for doing polling is actually a big problem these days. Because in the old days, we used to call people using landline telephones. In fact, I did one of these back when I was in grad school for one of my professors. And the way it worked is we literally took the phone book, called the person who was the very first person on the page, then skipped down 5 lines and called the next person who was on the page. Now, I'm willing to bet that many of you might not have ever even touched a phone book. Here's the problem. How many of you would I reach if I actually tried to do that same kind of interview? Probably zero. I probably wouldn't get a single young person because almost all of you are now on cell phones, and that means that you wouldn't even have shown up in my study. Instead, I would got a lot of old people, and usually older women, both because women tend to be more likely to live longer and because they're more likely to be the ones who answer the phone in a house. So that means my study would be really skewed. I would get the ideas of elderly women. I wouldn't get the ideas of a cross-section of the society. Another problem is that the actual facts could mean different things to different people. A classic example of this is in the movie Die Hard, when FBI agents are thinking about storming the building in order to rescue the hostages. And the one says to the other, "What do you expect we're going to lose?" And he said, "About 20%. And he said, "I can live with that." That's 20% of the hostages dying, and he's okay with that. And to be honest, that's actually a pretty good ratio, according to law enforcement. But according to regular people, we want to try to save every single person. So the facts are the same, but we might interpret them differently. Another video example I've given you here is a reference to a guy who makes about $400,000 a year, and he's complaining about it. And for most of us, $400,000 sounds like a dream. But for him, he's a business owner. which means that if he were to try to actually open up another business, $400,000 isn't enough to do that with. So the exact fact would be interpreted differently by you and me and him. Then the final issue is that the actual data might be correct, but you could be misleading us in how you present it. Here's one of my favorite examples of this. This is an actually genuine statistic of the year I graduated in high school. This wasn't my high school, this was a high school nearby, but this is an actually true statistic. 50% of the people who walked across the stage at graduation were pregnant. Now you're probably freaking out, thinking, what kind of place was this? Was there something crazy in the water? What a complete den of hedonism this must have been. But notice that stat is real, but doesn't actually give you the full context. That graduating class had only 2 people in it. One was male, one was female, and they had been married the previous summer. There was a farm family. His father had passed away when he was about 15, and he'd been dating the same girl for about 6 years. Since he was already basically raising the rest of his brothers and sisters, he decided to go ahead and just get married, and they were expecting their first kid, and everybody was happy for them. So in this example, that first glance at that 50% statistic was probably pretty shocking, but it's not that bad. So, as we get into the rest of this series of lectures about data, here's what I want you to look for. Instead of just keeping track of what kind of data exists and what it is, I want you to look at 3 different things. So in the next lectures, arrange your notes to take down 3 different types of information about each type of data. First, all the usual notes, whatever you would normally do. So keep track of things like definitions, maybe some examples that help you remember it, maybe keywords or paraphrases of things from the textbook. So take those notes down, those are good to have. But most of what I'm going to be grading you on is how you pick and choose the different kinds of evidence. And those decisions are guided not by being able to recognize what a statistic is, but what a statistic is good for and bad for. That's the 2 other things. Advantages. Each type of evidence has certain strengths, so be sure to keep track of those and use those in the process of preparing both of the next 2 speeches. And also the disadvantages. No one type of evidence is perfect for all cases. For example, in some cases, statistics are very powerful, depending on who you're speaking to. But in other cases, a statistic might go right over an audience's head, and a story would have been a lot more effective. So be sure to keep track of each of these 3 kinds of information as we go through the remaining videos in this particular series. I also wanted to break these up because otherwise it's an awful lot of stuff all at one time, and to give you an opportunity to watch only a video or 2 at a time.